India stands shaky. India has a Russian tilt. India's position has been unsatisfactory. You must have either read or heard about these headlines on the news. We all know that India's position on Russia Ukraine is a hot subject these days, as well as a source of gossip among geopolitical buff. It appears like there is this soap opera or Sasbo drama going on, with certain nations constantly criticizing or assessing and commenting on India's neutrality. India's neutrality has become a source of contention in world politics. Some nations have made numerous similarities and have even questioned India, like why India is maintaining a neutral stance. One of these is clearly by Uncle Sam, who has been challenging India's continued silence on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This all just brings us to one hot question: whether India's stance on Ukraine is a cowardly act or is it a well crafted diplomacy? You have tuned into a very right channel if you have been looking for answers. Namaste everyone, welcome to our channel Aryavarta Samprati, a tribute to India's mystic beauty, bravery, culture, tradition, and politics. So it was during the Cold War, India and the Soviet Union deepened their strategic, economic, military, and diplomatic ties. These relationships are maintained today by modern day Russia, even after the Soviet Union has ceased to exist. The Indo Russian partnership is divided into five core areas. One is political, second one is defense, third is nuclear energy for civil use, fourth is collaboration in fight against terrorism, and fifth one is space. Before we get started, let's take a look at how India and Russia's relationship has grown. If we look at the history of relation between these two nations, it is impossible to pinpoint a specific date. Although in the 4th century BC, Russian adventurer FNC Nikitin visited India, as evidenced by the documentation of his experiences in the book The Journey Beyond Three Seas. India and European countries utilized Russia as a transit point in the 18th century, and Indian traders traveled through the Russian towns such as Moscow and St. Petersburg. However, under the leadership of Stalin, who controlled the Soviet Union from 1922 to 1953, the relationship between India and Russia became icy at times. This was mostly due to Stalin's disdain for India and Indian leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. The ice was finally broken in 1955 when then Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru visited the Soviet Union in June 1955. And then the Communist Party's first secretary, Nikita Khrushchev, traveled to India in the fall of 1955. For the following 6 years, Russia undertook a process known as de-Stalinization, which brought Russia and India closer together than they had ever been. Moscow also recognized Indian sovereignty in Jammu and Kashmir as well as Goa's territory. Around the same time, a rift developed between Russia and China, as the Chinese began to perceive Russian policies as revisionist policy for communism, and the two countries became disengaged. As a result, when India and China went to war in 1962, Russia remained a neutral ground, much to China's displeasure. So when India also began testing its fire nuclear weapons in 1970, the United States was disapproving of the test, while it was Russia who backed India. The relationship between India and Russia even survived the dissolution of the Soviet Union, despite a few ups and downs. So now the question is, what all is at stake? Should India really support or be neutral to Russia's invasion of Ukraine? And should we really listen to the so-called fake torchbearer of peace and democracy, that is Uncle Sam? Well, considering that at present, the bilateral relationship between these two nations, that is India and Russia, has shown itself in various spheres such as economic trade, which is currently valued at $10.08 billion, with both countries setting a goal of $30 billion by 2025. As well as in politics, Russia and India are both members of UN, BRICS, G20 and SCO. India has also been heavily dependent on Russia for the import of different defense weapons and equipments in the defense sector. Even while India has attempted to expand its defense trade with nations such as United States, Israel, and France, Russian weaponry still continue to dominate. In 2018, India has agreed to buy S-400 fighter jets from Russia for $5 billion. Harshvi Shringla, our Indian Foreign Secretary, have also warned that without Russian spare parts, our shipment planes would not be able to sail or fly. Many cooperative initiatives between Russia and India have been launched, including the BrahMos crucial missile program, Sukhoi fighter planes, and a lot of other transport aircrafts. Other military equipments acquired or leased by India includes the T-90S Bhishma firing tank, Akula II nuclear submarines, and the INS Vikram. The Russia-Ukraine crisis has divided the world into two camps. There is polarization. One is led by United States and its NATO allies, and the other by countries such as Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and others such as North Korea, Cuba, and Syria, who blame US and the ever-expanding NATO for the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Apart from the above-mentioned nations, there is also a category of non-aligned countries such as India, China, and UAE, Egypt, Pakistan, which do not intend to take sides with anybody. The West as well as Russia are putting enormous pressure on these countries to assist them, with India obviously at the top of the list. Since the start of the conflict, India has been under enormous pressure from both the West and the Russia. So it would be very difficult for India to choose a clear position since it has a strong relation with both the US, which is its largest commercial partner, and Russia, which is its defense partner and a very long time ally. New Delhi does not want to adopt a posture that would be damaging to the country's and people's interest. The US first stated that it understands India's predicament, but as the conflict develops, its tone has shifted. It continues to preach to India on which side India should take, claiming that these decisions would determine India's place in the history. But despite enormous pressure and moral lessons, India remains solid in its diplomatic position, abstaining from voting against Russia in the UN on 3 times. So when asked about India's position on Russia-Ukraine problem in the Rajya Sabha, Honorable External Minister responded by citing 6 principles on which India's position is founded. The very first principle is that India demanded an end to all the violence and hostility immediately. India did not turn a blind eye to the situation in Ukraine. While abstaining from voting against Russia at United Nations, India chose a very balanced approach rather than implementing sanctions and merely criticizing Russia with words. India has declared before United Nations that international rules and treaties should be followed, as well as territorial integrity and sovereignty, plainly indicating the situation of Ukraine. The second principle is there is no other option, according to India, except to return to the road of discussion and diplomacy. The West has imposed different type of sanctions on Russia, yet this hasn't stopped Russia from invading Ukraine. In truth, it was a statement from Russia that it had been planning the invasion for months and was already prepared for the sanctions. This demonstrates the preceding premise. Thirdly, India also believes that international law and charters, as well as respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty, are the foundations of global order. This is an issue that India has often emphasized in the United Nations. Fourthly, India is calling for humanitarian access to crisis zones. India was taken off guard by the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which came out of nowhere. Its nationals were stranded in Ukraine, including roughly 20,000 students. Due to India's strong diplomatic power and diplomacy, it was feasible to evacuate a resident even from the worst affected cities. The Prime Minister of India met with the leaders of Russia and Ukraine. In this case, only because India maintained its line of communication open with Russia, this evacuation became possible. Fifth, India is assisting the war-torn Ukraine with humanitarian aid. It has already sent 90 tons of humanitarian aid to Ukraine, with more on the way. And lastly, India maintains contact with both the nation's president. The Honorable Prime Minister Narendra Modi met with both the leaders and encouraged them to engage in conversation. Honorable External Ministry further mentioned that Indian foreign policies are made in India's best interest. And I repeat, India's best interest. India is driven by Indian thought, viewpoints, and interest. In such a circumstance, India's priorities have to be clarified as a nation. India's primary priority was the evacuation of its nationals from Ukraine. The second point to consider is India's strategic interest in Russia, both in terms of defense and commerce. And above all, Russia's support for India in United Nations is unquestionable. Russia has often shown to be an enduring ally of India, firmly defending India's interests and sovereignty in United Nations. We all cannot ignore the fact that it was United States that introduced or supported the majority of United Nations resolution against India. Even if the current equations between India and America have changed, our history cannot be ignored, right? The issue of national security comes first. India is bordered by countries that are not so friendly. Pakistan on one hand is a terror state while China on the other is an expansionist power. In such a case, us- we simply cannot afford to throw a friend like Russia into China's arm by siding with US right away. What actions did the West take to preserve India's interests 2 years ago when it was invaded by Chinese forces and the whole globe was devastated by the pandemic? There were no support for India from US or from any of the Western countries. No resolution and no sanctions. Russia was the one who stepped up to act as a mediator in dispute between India and China. So should India really abandon its connection with Russia in order to curry favor with an ally that has shown to be very untrustworthy? Is it really going to make a difference if India criticizes Russia? Has the West threat and condemnation of Russia come to an end? We all know answer to this question. Only arbitration and mediation can put an end to the conflict. It has been observed in our history that throughout the Cold War era in 1960s, India as the non-alignment movement operated as a buffering force helping to diffuse tension and threats to international peace and order. We would like to see your views on the same. So comment below your views and let us know. What do you think about India's stand? Is it a cowardly act or a master and a crafted diplomacy for the national interests of the country? Also, keep an eye on Aryavarta Samprati until then and continue to fall in love with India. Also, don't forget to subscribe, share, and press the bell button on the channel. Jai Hind.